I don't think that publishing information about in a kidnapping case is worth putting that person's life at risk. I don't think that that information is vital enough for us to do something that we knowingly is going to put somebody's life at risk. So I think that there are probably, I think it's a very complex area, and I don't think that there's a blanket rule, and I don't think that there's a rule book that can just pull out and say, this is a situation, here's the rule book, okay, publish, don't publish. I think that there's going to be nuances and differences in every case that maybe will inform you to make a different decision. I think that sometimes there are cases in which somebody is so high profile that that information just won't and shouldn't be embargoed. For instance, if the President of the United States gets abducted, nobody's going to embargo that information, right? I mean, if they find that out, if the Prime Minister of Canada, if, maybe even to the extent of like a very, very high-profile entertainer or a hockey player, I think that those kinds of situations are going to be very, very difficult to maintain embargoes. And there's some cases there might be a pressing enough public interest to actually to publish that information without sort of placing an embargo. I think that those are really the rarities in a lot of cases, and I think that there's a lot of circumstances in which we can consider on a case-by-case basis whether or not it's going to have, there's any value in maintaining an embargo, right? And we've had a few of those cases, obviously. I mean, it's very, very clear to me. I know there's sort of been a lot of debate and controversy about the difference between those two cases, and I understand why. It's because in the case of a journalist, Melissa Fung, we maintained a blackout for many, many weeks. In the case of a diplomat, Robert Fowler, we didn't maintain any kind of an embargo on that information at all. And the cases were very, very different in one really important aspect. That is that we were told that we woke up one day to wire reports that were being sent around the world that Robert Fowler had been abducted, and his colleague. There was no point or value in an embargoing information that was readily available and been blasted around the world, that was on everybody's website in the planet. Because the whole point of an embargo is nobody finds out, that it's a total blackout in information. It's not a sort of, and the embargo doesn't mean limit, try to really play down the information, or it's very quite binary. You're either all in or you're all out. So there's a full embargo or there's no embargo. And so in that case, we had no choice. We had nobody to come to us. If the family of Robert Fowler or the government had come to us, called up the editor-in-chief and said, listen, very, very important person has been abducted. We believe quite strongly for this reason, and this reason, that if you publish that information, his life will be at risk, or make it massively more complex for us to get him back safely, we would have said, we will entertain that consideration. And we may very well have entered into an embargo on that basis. If we had that request, if we had been able to persuade ourselves that the reasons for that request were valid, we may have maintained that embargo. We would have, as we did in the Fung case, said, we're in, but if the embargo gets broken, we're out. So it's very simple. We're not going to have BBC publish, and we're not going to publish because we think that that's going to have some sort of meaningful impact. It's not going to have any impact. If somebody's publishing, then everybody's publishing. In the Fung case, the opposite happened. The first thing we heard was a request for the embargo. It happened, and there's very particular circumstances within. This is where I've long said that the media does have an advantage in these things. In Kabul, there's a massively concentrated group of very, very high-profile media organizations there. Everybody's there. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, BBC, CNN, the whole show. When Melissa was abducted, the capacity for journalists who interact with all of those journalists in that very powerful and concentrated center of the media, able to very, very quickly intersect with that group of people and say, please, do not publish. And literally within hours of that happening, every media organization wire service in the world had been asked that simultaneously, and they'd all agreed that they would maintain and respect an embargo. Totally different. Like in the Fowler case, you can imagine the complexities of that. Like, say Robert Fowler was abducted, and then the Ontario government, or the Canadian government, or say his family says, how do we get an embargo in place? Well, I don't know who to call. Who do I call it? Reuters? Or who do I call the Associated Press? Somebody get on the phone, New York Times. You can't do it. So that time becomes very, very, very precious and moving very quickly to try to tamp down, to get the word out to the wire services. Don't even put 3 paragraphs out in the wires, which is what AFP did. It wasn't like they went crazy. It wasn't a Pearl Harbor story. It was such and such has been abducted. Then boom, the embargo's gone. So you see how complex it is. The media does have an advantage because they understand, they know other media, they understand how to work with other media, and they understand how to talk to. There's a culture of cooperation amongst media companies, I think, that give them an advantage. That I acknowledge. But I'd say, go back to my original point, if we'd woken up in the morning and it said CBC journalist Melissa Fong has been abducted and she's being held by the Taliban near Kabul, and that was an AFP and everybody else in the plant, we woke up in the morning, we wouldn't have maintained an embargo. It's careful to look at what you're writing about and publishing and not just look at it from a sort of, kind of one-dimensional view. This is the story makes sense. You do have to go through a different process. You can say, am I not thinking, if I'm pushing myself in the eyes of the kidnappers, are there things in here that I'm not thinking of that if they knew would make them more hostile towards Robert Fowler? Would they make them demand more? I know that one of the things that Robert has said is that the information about the trip to the gold mine made the kidnappers think, oh, they have a lot of gold, or they have access to gold or something like that, and they're more valuable. I didn't buy that. It's a legitimate argument, and it's one that he can make. I just don't think it kind of holds water myself. But it's an argument. So I think that there were conversations like that about specific pieces of information. We had to ask ourselves and sort of quite carefully about whether or not any of that, these incremental bits of information would make things worse. I think we have to be persuaded that those arguments are sound and not just start to self-censor, not to sort of self-censor defensively by saying, well, absolutely anything could give it away, so let's just not publish anything. There is a line and a judgment that has to be made about that, and you know what? It's not an exact science. I mean, the thing that that is very difficult for, and trying to ask for sympathy for the editors, but we're people, and we really are concerned. I mean, the last thing in the world I would want to imagine about myself is that my work has led to somebody being harmed, and the journalists that are out there reporting on these cases feel the same way. I mean, we could have had a discussion. We didn't have a discussion because it was the point was moot. It was on everybody's website. It was released, and again, there's no point in holding to an embargo if other people are publishing. There just isn't. Not in this day and age, right? I mean, certainly not in a digital age. Information is instantaneously transmitted around the world, and so everybody knew. The people that, there was nobody that would have been shielded from that information. So that information was out there and widely disseminated. As journalists, our default setting is publish. So I don't think I would disagree with being hostile. I'm hostile to the idea of censoring any news event whatsoever. I mean, I think the only criteria that we should use is it newsworthy? Is it sort of worthy of being reported? Is the story meaningful? Is I think always a criteria that we should apply to absolutely anything. So our default is publish, publish, publish. There's all sorts of circumstances we don't publish in, or don't publish under certain circumstances. I mean, around court proceedings, judicial proceedings, all those kinds of things. So there's a whole sort of range of not embargoing, but a range of where we sort of limit our kind of publications of all sorts of kinds of material. But our general default as a news agency is always to publish, and I don't think it's any different in these sort of kidnapping cases as well, right? When we can, but there are particular circumstances in which we accept the idea that there's some value in holding to an embargo.